You know, schizophrenia has got to be one of the most complex and, let's be honest, misunderstood conditions in all of medicine. For more than 100 years, it has seriously challenged how we think about the mind, about illness, and even about reality itself. So in this explainer, we're going to cut right through that confusion and build a clear, modern understanding of what schizophrenia is, all based on what science tells us today.
So, let's start with the big question. What is schizophrenia, really? If we look past the stereotypes and the sensationalism, what does the clinical and scientific picture actually look like? It's a question that has changed so much over time, and as you'll see, the answer is a whole lot more nuanced than you might think. All right, let's dive in.
Here's the game plan. First, we'll get into the clinical picture, what the lived experience is actually like. Then, we'll see how that experience gets turned into a formal diagnosis, and we'll touch on some related disorders to see where the lines are drawn. After that, we're going to zoom out and look at its global impact, and finally, we'll get into the really big question, what do we know about the causes?
Okay, first up, the clinical picture. Because to even begin to understand schizophrenia, we have to start with what it feels like, the symptoms that really define the experience of the disorder.
So, when clinicians talk about symptoms, they usually split them into two big groups. On one hand, you have positive symptoms. Now, this is super important. Positive here doesn't mean good, it means the presence of something abnormal, something that's been added to a person's reality, like delusions or hallucinations. And on the other hand, you have negative symptoms, which mean the exact opposite, the absence or loss of normal functions, a kind of reduction in the things we all typically do and feel.
And if we dig into those negative symptoms a bit more, they're often called the 4 A's, which is a really helpful way to remember them. First, you've got alogia, which isn't just being shy, it's a real drop in how much someone speaks on their own. Then there's avolition, which is a deep loss of motivation to get things done. Next is affective flattening, where someone's emotional expression becomes really limited. And finally, anhedonia, which is the inability to get pleasure from things that used to be enjoyable. You can really see how these represent a profound loss of everyday function.
But wait, it doesn't stop with just positive and negative symptoms. In recent years, we've realized there's a third, absolutely crucial category, cognitive symptoms. And here's why this is such a game changer. While the positive symptoms, like hallucinations, might seem more dramatic, it's often these cognitive issues, trouble with memory, attention, planning, that are the single biggest predictor of how a person will actually function in their day-to-day life. I mean, think about it. All those skills are what you need to hold down a job or manage your life. So these are now seen as a core part of the illness.
All right, so that brings us to our next section. How do we take all of this complex, lived experience, and turn it into a formal diagnosis? This is where the subjective world of symptoms meets the structured criteria of medicine.
You know, the idea of schizophrenia didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's been evolving for over a century. It kind of started back in 1893 with a guy named Emil Kraepelin, who called it dementia praecox, focusing on how it progressed over time. Then in 1911, Eugene Bleuler gave us the name we use today, schizophrenia. And he didn't mean a split personality, but a splitting of mental functions. And much later, Kurt Schneider tried to make diagnosis more clear-cut by identifying these first-rank symptoms he thought were unique to the disorder. And you know what's wild? Even today, the experts don't have one single universal definition. Just look at the two big diagnostic manuals, the American DSM-5 and the International ICD-10. They actually disagree on some key things. The DSM says you need signs of disturbance for 6 months, while the ICD only requires 1 month of active symptoms. The DSM also got rid of the old subtypes like paranoid schizophrenia, but the ICD still uses them. It just goes to show you this is still a concept that's very much in motion.
You know, sometimes the best way to define something is to look at what it's not. So to get an even clearer picture of schizophrenia, it's super helpful to look at some related conditions that sit right on its borders. This is all about defining the boundaries.
These are what we call schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and the differences often boil down to two things: time and mood. So if someone has psychotic symptoms, but they last for less than a month, that's called a brief psychotic disorder. If they last for more than a month but less than 6, it's called schizophreniform disorder. And if you see a major mood episode, like severe depression or mania, happening right alongside the psychotic symptoms, the diagnosis might be schizoaffective disorder instead.
Okay, let's pull back from the individual diagnosis for a moment and look at the big picture. How common is schizophrenia around the world, and who does it tend to affect? It's time for an epidemiological snapshot.
So what are the odds of developing this disorder over your entire life? Well, the most solid data we have puts that lifetime risk at about 7.2 people for every 1,000. Now, that might sound small, but it works out to just under 1% of the whole population. That means millions upon millions of people are affected worldwide, which makes its impact absolutely huge and a major public health concern.
So who does this tend to affect? Well, there are some really clear patterns when you look at age and gender. For guys, as you can see on this chart, there's a big peak in onset right in their early 20s. For women, it's a bit different. The range is broader, and they often have a second, smaller peak when they're in their late 30s or 40s.
And on top of that, if you look at the overall numbers, major studies show that schizophrenia is more common in men than in women. The ratio is about 1.4 men for every 1 woman with the diagnosis. It's another one of these key puzzle pieces that researchers are working hard to figure out.
And that leads us to the final and maybe the biggest question of all. Where does schizophrenia come from? Honestly, for decades, this has been one of the central mysteries in all of neuroscience and psychiatry.
The single biggest clue we have? It comes from genetics. I mean, after years of studying twins and families, the evidence is overwhelming. Schizophrenia is highly heritable. Just look at this chart. It's estimated that a staggering 80% of the risk for developing schizophrenia is inherited through our genes.
But, and I really want to stress this is so important, genes are not destiny. They are risk factors, not determinants. Just because you have a genetic predisposition does not mean you will definitely develop the illness. That other 20% on the chart, things like environmental factors, stressful life events, other influences, that part plays an absolutely crucial role in whether that genetic risk ever actually turns into reality. It is not a purely genetic disorder.
So, where does all this leave us? I think this quote really captures it perfectly. Schizophrenia isn't just one illness. In a way, it's a mirror that reflects the biggest question psychiatry is still trying to answer. How do we define what a disease is? How do we classify human experience? And how do we find the ultimate causes of our deepest struggles? The journey to fully understand it is far from over.